Imagine a goddess whose domain stretches across life and death, from sensuality to sorcery, from battlefields to meadows. A goddess who is worshipped and feared, desired and condemned. Her name is Freyja, and she does not merely belong to the past, because she's with us here still, in literature, in language, in feminist thought, and even in the structure of our desire. Today we will trace her roots, her myths, her metamorphosis, and how she is reawakened in the modern age. Hello and welcome to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. I appreciate you coming to hang out with me and I really hope that you enjoy it here. If you do, please consider following or subscribing on your favourite podcast platform. And you can also find me over on Blue Sky and on TikTok. All of the links will be in the show notes as per usual. If you were celebrating, I hope you had a lovely Easter. And if you were in the UK and you were lucky enough to get all 4 days of the 4-day weekend off of work, I hope it was restful for you. If you had to work, I hope it wasn't too bad for you. I always find after bank holidays that I am so disoriented, like I could literally not tell you what day it is right now, but I do know that this episode is late, and that's probably down to the fact that I don't know what day it is. I also know that I have been promising you Patreon for quite some time, and for those that are waiting for it, I promise you it's coming. I am just getting the final touches sorted on things like the Discord server, which is always a little bit tricky. I have set one up before, but not without help. And I definitely have some lovely, lovely people helping me out on this one. So to those who are providing me with their big, juicy brains and knowledge, I really do appreciate you so much. You are the best. And to all of you who are looking forward to it, it will be with you before the end of this month, I promise you. You can absolutely hold me to that. Now, on to the good stuff. I know we've spent a good while in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, so it's probably about time that we tried somewhere different, isn't it? So this week, I'm going to take you to Norse mythology for the first time in a long time. In fact, it's the first time since way back in September when this podcast was just a little baby and we covered hell. And although you're already going to know this because it literally will say it in the episode title, we're going to talk all things Freyja today. And I know some of you have asked for Valkyries and they are absolutely on my list, but it's Freyja that we're locking in on today. So grab yourselves a little something to eat, maybe some of your leftover Easter chocolate and a little something to drink, and let's crack on. The best way to unpick Freyja is to begin at the roots of Norse cosmology, and this was a world made not by gods, but by the collision of ice and fire. Born into the tribe of Vanir, Freyja stands apart from the more martial Aesir gods, like Odin and Thor. Where the Aesir rule the sky and war, the Vanir are deeply entangled with the earth, fertility, nature, abundance and foresight. Freyja's father was Njord, god of the sea, wealth and wind, and her twin brother is Freyja, associated with fertility, kingship and prosperity. But Freyja emerges as something a little bit more transcendent. She's neither merely a fertility goddess nor a war deity, but she's a bit of a liminal figure, moving between realms. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context before we go too deep into Freyja herself, because it does help set the scene a little bit. And that piece of context is the Aesir-Vanir War, which is a bit of a foundational myth in Norse mythology, and it reflects deep cultural and spiritual tension between two groups of gods. The Aesir, who were associated with order, authority and war, and the Vanir, who were linked to fertility, nature and prosperity. And this war, it was a pretty big deal. It wasn't merely a physical conflict, but it was also a symbolic clash of values and worldviews within the Norse cosmos. According to the myth, The war began when the Vanir, provoked by what they saw as deceit and cruelty from the Aesir, sent the goddess Gulvig to Asgard. There, the Aesir attempted to kill her 3 times, each time burning her, but she kept returning, unscathed and reborn. And this act outraged the Vanir, sparking a war that was long, chaotic, and seemingly unresolvable. Which is a bit funny, really, because they literally sent her there and then got upset when the Aesir attempted to kill her. But I digress. These battles that they had, they were fierce and they were vicious, but neither side seemed to be able to win. And eventually, they sort of cottoned onto this. They realised it. They realised that this endless fighting and warfare was sort of pointless. And so the two sides sought peace and reconciliation. And what's the best way to reconcile? Exchanging hostages, of course. So the Vanir sent Njord and his children to live with the Aesir, while the Aesir sent Honir and Mimir to the Vanir. And this exchange helped blend the two divine families, leading to a more unified pantheon where distinct traits from both were preserved but also shared. And the war and its resolution are deeply symbolic of integration between differing aspects of life, between chaos and order, nature and civilization, magic and force, and it suggests a mythic model for resolving conflict through compromise and synthesis rather than domination. And some scholars also interpret the myth as a reflection of historical tribal mergers or shifts in religious practice in early Germanic societies. And why is this important for us to know? Well, because you heard, it places Freyja, the daughter of Njord, in Asgard. Now, you might think that Freyja might be a little bit subdued in Asgard. After all, this was a place where she had literally been forced to go. But actually, she became a central figure there, and she became a teacher of magic to the high god Odin himself. And that is because she brought seiðr, a mysterious form of ecstatic, trance-based magic, into the core of the divine order. And by doing so, she also introduced ambiguity, which was something that the Norse cosmos rarely tolerates. Seiðr was often viewed as feminine, and when Odin practiced it, he is mocked for urgi, a term connotating unmanliness or shame. And Freyja teaches this power at a cost, and thus from the beginning, she represents a feminine force that defies control. And all of this stems from deep-rooted oral tradition, but it was first mentioned in literature, in the Poetic Edda, and this was a 13th century compilation of earlier Norse poems, and it's one of the most important surviving sources of Old Norse mythology and heroic legend. It's pretty much the backbone of what we know today about Norse gods, myths, and things like Ragnarok, not the Marvel movie, and figures like Odin, Thor, Loki, and of course Freyja. And here's a side note, the Poetic Edda is actually a really interesting read because all of its poems are composed in alliterative verse and feature super vivid imagery. So I would really recommend checking that out. I'll put some links in the show notes so you can have a read of some of the parts of the Poetic Edda that might help you learn about Freyja. And the Poetic Edda is not to be confused with the Prose Edda, which was written by Snorri Sturluson, who we mentioned way back in that episode on Hell, and that is a bit more like a guidebook explaining the myths in the Poetic Edda in more detail. In combination, the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda are pretty indispensable for understanding Norse worldview. And it's right here in the Poetic Edda that we find Freyja, where she appears in the poem Voluspa, meaning prophecy of the seeress, and she is named as a powerful figure associated with magic, love, beauty, fertility, and death. Freyja appears in these texts as a fully formed figure. She's not a side character introduced with caution, she doesn't have any ambiguity about her. She arrives already a central deity, and this is indicative of how deep her roots in oral tradition were prior to the Poetic Edda. And these roots can also be seen in place names in Scandinavia that preserve the root Frey, such as Freyjaslundr, which is Freya's grove, and all of these symbols and signs just point to her being venerated in cultic practice far before oral tales were committed to writing. And what does she look like? Well, Freyja is described as exceedingly beautiful. She's often considered the most radiant of all of the goddesses. She's a figure who embodies sensuality and fertility and powerful magic authority. And there's no sort of single uniform description of her physical appearance that survives in the Eddic texts, but what we can do is sort of piece together all the different fragments of the poetic references to create a little bit of a composite image of her. So she's often depicted with golden or amber hair, and this was a common marker of divine beauty in Germanic tradition. And her beauty was said to be so striking that she was coveted by gods, men, and even giants. In several myths, her mere presence is enough to incite desire or awe. She is often adorned with the legendary brisingamen, and this was a beautiful necklace crafted by dwarves that symbolises fertility, power, and her association with earthly and magical riches. And the necklace is so gorgeous and so magical that it actually becomes a source of mythic tension in various different Norse tales. And Freyja is also closely tied to falcons and cats, which are part of her iconography. She owns a cloak of falcon feathers, which allows her and others to fly through worlds. I think a cloak of falcon feathers sounds pretty cool, actually, and I think we should bring back cloaks, because sometimes I would really love to dramatically exit a room with the swish of a cloak. If you too are pro-cloak, let me know in the comments. But anyway, I digress. Freyja's chariot is actually famously drawn by two large cats. And again, it's a pretty cool image. Who said cat ladies weren't cool? In Norse art, she is sometimes depicted in flowing robes, a goddess of radiant beauty and bearing, wearing brisingamen, flanked by cats, and with falcon feathers draped over her shoulders or arms. And the Norse people held Freyja in extremely high esteem, and there was actually a so-called cult of Freyja, which was widespread and deeply influential in Norse religious life. And this cult centred on the worship of Freyja as a goddess of love, fertility, war, and seiðr. She was believed to receive half of the slain in battle into her hall, and held great authority over death and the afterlife, rivaling even Odin himself. Archaeological evidence like place names and literary accounts suggests that she was venerated at specific sacred sites, and her followers may very well have included seeresses and priestesses who practiced powerful magical rites. Her worship likely blended agrarian fertility rituals with shamanic traditions, making her probably one of the most complex and revered deities in the Norse pantheon. Okay, so I think we've got a pretty good understanding now of what Freyja looked like and how she came to be in Asgard, so I think it's about time I told you some of the most famous stories about her. As per usual, I have chosen a couple of stories and a couple of versions of those stories that I like the best, that I wanted to tell you, but please do bear in mind that there are so many stories of Freyja, and there are so many different interpretations of these stories, so if you are already a bit of a Freyja expert, I'm just picking the ones that I like the most, but they might not be the ones that you know. So if there are other versions of stories or different stories that you think I might be interested in, please let me know in the comments, because I'd love to read them. But anyway, let's crack on. Do you remember the necklace that I told you about a few minutes ago, brisingamen? The first story that I'm going to tell you today is how Freyja came to gain possession of it. And it's a scandalous and spicy little story. So here goes. In the shadow of twilight, when the stars shone upon the 9 realms, Freyja, goddess of love and beauty, wandered alone through the woods of Midgard. She felt restless that night, stirred by a longing that she couldn't quite name. As the wind gently rustled through the trees and the moon spilled its silver onto the earth, she came upon a glade, hidden to all but the most fated of souls. There, beneath the earth, in the deep forge of the dwarves, the 4 sons of Vivaldi laboured, Alfrig, Dvalin, Berling, and Gre, craftsmen whose hands wove magic into metal, whose breath forged enchantment into gold. Through a crack in the rock, Freyja saw it. A necklace like no other. Brisingamen. It shimmered in a way that she had never seen before. Each link a gleam of desire. Each gem glistening, enticing her. It was not just beautiful. It was alive with old power, ancient and unyielding. It called to her. She stepped into the forge, her golden hair catching the glow of molten gold, her presence like the rising of the sun in their dark cavern. The dwarves turned, spellbound by her grace. She asked if she could have the necklace, and they refused. Not for gold, not for silver, not for all the treasures in Asgard would they part with their masterpiece. Unless she agreed to their price. 1 night with each of them. At this request, the forge grew silent, tension hanging in the air, mixing with the heat of the fire. Freyja, proud and radiant, did not falter. She knew all too well the cost of desire, of power, of beauty unparalleled. And so she agreed. And for 4 nights, she lay with the dwarves, her presence lightning dressed for sin, velvet clinging to every curve. They touched a goddess, and they found themselves undone. When the final night passed and the sun rose on the horizon, Brisingamen lay in her hands. Its weight felt satisfying. She left the forge without a word, the necklace clasped around her throat, its magic now twined with her own. But whispers rose with the dawn, and the tale of the necklace and how it had come to Freyja reached the ears of Loki, ever watchful and ever jealous. He waited for the sun to go down once more and slithered through the night, stealing the necklace from her breast as she slept, and taking it to Odin. Judgment came swift, and shame clung like a shadow to the goddess of desire. Yet Odin, wise but cold, returned the necklace on one cruel condition. Freyja must stir war among kings. She must drive mortals to battle for the sake of God's sport. She agreed, for she would not be parted from Brisingamen. And so it was that Freyja bore the necklace of flame and sorrow, a symbol of beauty won through power, passion and sacrifice, a fire that still kindles the hearts of those who dare to desire. And so Brisingamen gleamed at her throat, a treasure that bore the weight of choices carved in shadow. And it was no ordinary adornment. It pulsed with the fire of dwarven cunning, with the sweat of lust, and the ache of bargains struck in silence. It was a reminder to gods and mortals alike that power, true power, was never free. That beauty could beguile, but it could also bind. And Freyja, though worshipped, though adored, bore it not just as a goddess, but as a woman who had dared to claim what she desired, no matter the cost. The other gods watched her differently after that, some with reverence, others with suspicion. Thor would not speak of it, but his eyes lingered too long when Brisingamen caught the sun. Frigg kept her counsel, but even she, Odin's queen, did not wear such a thing of wonder. And Loki never ceased his mocking smile. But there was envy in it, sharp as a blade's edge. For he had stolen the necklace, but he had not kept it. Even he could not. And Freyja stirred the wars just as Odin had commanded. Kings rose and fell with her whim. Swords sang, blood soaked the earth. And yet none could say if the goddess grieved or gloried in the storm. And in the quiet hours when her falcon cloak lay folded and her cats slept curled by her feet, Freyja would touch Brisingamen lightly, as one might touch a scar that never fades, not with regret, never with regret, but with a fierce knowing that she alone among the gods had taken what she hungered for, forged her fate in the fire of her own desire, and borne the price with unflinching grace. And still the necklace shone in dreams and stories, in the flicker of candlelight, in the trembling hands of poets who dared to sing her name. Brisingamen, the necklace of fire, lit by longing, was hers, and through it, so was the legend that no time, no god, and no death could undo. And as always, guys, like I said, there are a few versions of this story, including one where Heimdall, also known as Idris Elba, fights Loki to return the necklace to Freyja. But this is just the version that I liked and wanted to tell you today. And now let me tell you about Freyja and her husband. In the twilight mists of Asgard, where golden halls gleamed beneath skies woven with northern lights, there dwelt Freyja, goddess of love, beauty, and the fierce fire of war. She was not a soft spirit, no mere maiden of roses and ribbons. Freyja was a tempest, wrapped in silk, a warrior draped in gold. Her heart, though wild and free, belonged to one, Odur, her husband, a mysterious god rarely seen by others, shrouded in lore and spoken of in whispers. They loved as stars fall, bright, brief in sight, but eternal in pull. Their passion shook the heavens, and their union burned in a light that rivaled the Bifrost itself. But Odur, bound to some ancient wanderlust, vanished from her side. No storm heralded his leaving. Freyja searched the realms, her tears falling not as water, but as purest gold. They struck the earth and became treasures, yet to her they were curses, fragments of agony that she could never reclaim. She wandered among mortals in disguise, her beauty cloaked in grief, her eyes haunted with the endless ache of absence. In every land she crossed, she whispered his name to the winds. She cast it into the rivers. She screamed it into the mountains, and still he did not answer. The gods grew wary of her sorrow, for even love, when scorched by loss, becomes a flame that consumes. Some say Odur was lost to madness, others that he walked the 9 worlds, searching for truths unknown even to the Norns. But Freyja never gave up. She took lovers, bold gods and cunning dwarves, kings and warriors, but never again did her heart beat as it once did for Odur. Her soul remained tethered to a ghost. And so she still waits, fierce and radiant, a queen among gods and monsters. She rides in her chariot pulled by cats, dons the feathered cloak that lets her soar as a falcon, and leads the Valkyries to claim the fallen. But when the stars are cloaked and the world is hushed, she stands at the edge of all things, staring into the dark, listening, always listening, for the echo of footsteps and the return of the one whose absence wrote her legend. And finally, I'll tell you one more that's a bit more light-hearted, because Norse mythology is actually quite funny at times, and that's the tale of Freyja and Thor. It begins with outrage. One morning, Thor awoke to find his mighty hammer missing, gone, vanished, as if stolen by the shadows. Without his hammer, Asgard was vulnerable, its protector disarmed. Thunder rumbled in his chest as he bellowed in fury. Who would dare take his hammer? Loki, the silver-tongued trickster, volunteered to investigate. He borrowed Freyja's feathered cloak and flew across the 9 realms. Freyja watched, her eyes narrowed in suspicion and annoyance. As he soared into the land of the Jotuna, the frost giant, Thrymr, revealed himself as the thief, and his price for the hammer was Freyja. Freyja, the goddess of beauty, battle, and desire. He demanded her hand in marriage in exchange for the hammer. He dreamed of her draped in bridal silks, chained to him by golden vows. It was madness. I'm just going to break this for a second to let you know that I'm picturing Bowser and Princess Peach in this moment. Now, Thor, for some reason, expected Freyja to just play along with this, and when he and Loki returned and explained the scheme, Freyja exploded. Not with delicate sorrow, but with such rage that her necklace clanged against her heaving chest. The halls of the gods trembled. She would not be bargained like a trinket for a hammer, no matter how mighty. So the gods had to hatch a different plan. A plan as absurd as it was bold. Because in this plan, Thor would go as the bride. And he clad himself in a wedding dress, he put a veil on drawn low, and he even took Brisingamen fastened tight around his neck. So picture this, big, gigantic Thor, muscles rippling, the embodiment of masculinity in a delicate little wedding dress. And Loki didn't get away with this either, because he shapeshifted into a handmaiden, and together they travelled to Jotunheim, where the giants awaited, prepared for the wedding of the century. But even with his veil on, even with his pretty little dress, and I'm sure like some makeup, Thor could barely contain his fury. And he also couldn't contain his appetite, because he ate an entire ox. He had 8 whole salmon, and he drank enough mead for a whole warband. And Thrymr was kind of puzzled by this, but Loki managed to smooth things over and soothed him a little by saying she hasn't eaten in days. She was so eager, she was so nervous about the wedding that she's just not eaten, so she's just sort of catching up on her meals. And finally, when the meal had been finished, when the best man had said his speeches, when they'd had the first dance and they'd cut the cake, the hammer was brought forth, and it was laid in the bride's lap as a wedding gift. And in that moment, Thor threw off his veil, and with a roar like the cracking sky, he seized the hammer and turned the feast into a slaughter. Giants fell like trees under the lightning's wrath. And what did Freyja do while all of this was taking place? Well, she just watched. She watched and she laughed. To her, this was a lesson for Thor. Let him wear the dress and learn the price of presumption. And Asgard was saved, not by strength alone, but by Thor in a pretty dress and Freyja's sharp refusal to be anyone's prize. So there you have it. There are 3 stories about Freyja, but as I said, there are so many more. I'll put some links in the show notes to stories you might want to read. And now we've heard them, I think it's time we take a little look at how Freyja changed as time went on. After the age of Vikings came and went, the image and interpretation of Freyja underwent a profound transformation. And if you've been a listener for a while, you'll already know that these changes will have mirrored broader shifts in culture, religion, nationalism, and academic trends. Freyja, who began as the fierce and multifaceted goddess of love, war, death, and sorcery, evolved through medieval suppression, Enlightenment reinterpretation, romantic idealization, and into a bit of a nationalist symbol by the 1800s. As we know, Freyja was a bit of a central figure of the Norse pantheon. She was venerated for her beauty and her power in battle and deep association with magic and the afterlife. And who fears all of these things more than Christians, right? So with the arrival of Christianity in Scandinavia, Freyja was gradually reinterpreted through the lens of the good old Christian morality framework, ecclesiastical politics, and literary recontextualization. And more of Scandinavia was converted to Christianity between the 10th and 12th centuries, and worship of Freyja was eventually outlawed. And she was swept under this rising tide of religious reform that sought to erase the old gods from the hearts of the people. Christian clergy saw Freyja as a particularly threatening figure, not only because of her divine status, but because of the qualities that she embodied: sensuality, independence, and magical prowess. These traits clashed violently with medieval Christian ideals of womanhood and virtue. And I was doing a bit of research because I like to read a lot of academic sort of journals and things while I'm making these podcasts, and I came across a really interesting quote by Lan Wang in her 2017 thesis, and she said, Freyja's overt sexuality and magical practice came into direct conflict with medieval Christian values. She was thus either erased or vilified in texts written by Christian scribes. Her open embrace of sexual freedom, her role as a battle goddess who chose the slain, and her command of sorcery made her an archetype of forbidden femininity, and in some cases, a latent demonic figure. And I think that sums it up quite nicely, doesn't it? But despite the church's efforts, Freyja's presence managed to endure in the literary traditions of Iceland, particularly in texts including the ones I mentioned earlier, like the Prose Edda of the 13th century. And these works, though they were compiled under Christian influence, helped to preserve Norse myth in a mythologized form that was palatable to the medieval audience. They would accept that a little bit better because it was more of a fantastical story. But it is important to remember that these were not true, faithful recollections of pagan belief. they were still moralised retellings. And Freyja, though she was still beautiful and still powerful, she was framed more often through Christian ideals of temptation and caution, and her actions were shaded with suspicion. And I read another really interesting work about feminine religious identity in Iceland, and in that work, they noted that in medieval retellings, Freyja's magical abilities and her acquisition of Brisingamen are framed as cautionary tales about female temptation and vanity. And the story of how Freyja slept with these 4 dwarves to acquire the magical necklace was no longer a myth of desire and power and taking what you want at any cost. It was a warning. And remember earlier we touched on this a little bit. One of the most important aspects of Freyja's divine identity was her mastery of seiðr, which was a powerful and taboo form of Norse magic. Seiðr, like I said earlier, was deeply gendered in the Norse world. It was a form of foresight and spirit communication, and it was associated with women and seen as shameful when practiced by men. So as you can imagine, in a medieval Christian context, this made it doubly dangerous. William P. Reeves, in his 2008 analysis of the goddess's cult, remarks, "The practice of seiðr, taught by Freyja, was seen as deviant by medieval Christians, particularly because of its associations with women and transgression of gender norms." So Freyja's status as a seeress or a magical queen was not admired by the medievals, it was feared, and it was that fear that was encoded into the shifting narratives about her. And even as her religious significance faded, Freyja's legacy clung to the Scandinavian landscape in folk memory. Her name lived on in place names, like I said earlier, like Freyjalunda and Freyhov, evidence of a once thriving cult that left deep roots in the landscape. And these remnants suggest that in more rural or conservative communities, elements of her worship might have persisted, if a bit quietly, embedded in seasonal rites or whispered stories. She was perhaps remembered in the form of local spirits or nature goddesses, divested of her name, but still carrying her essence. In some Icelandic folktales, echoes of Freyja appear as enchanted women, as elven queens or fairy mistresses, severed from her mythological lineage, but still resonant in tone. By the late medieval period, Freyja was no longer worshipped, but remained alive in literature and folklore, reshaped by the religious and cultural transformations of the Christian North. She was not the goddess that she once was. She was no longer a sovereign chooser of the slain or a mistress of magic, but neither was she entirely forgotten. Instead, she lingered on the page and in the hills, her story reshaped to serve the values of a new world, yet still whispering of an old one. And then along came the Renaissance period of around the 14th to 17th centuries, where Freyja's presence in cultural consciousness grew dimmer still. While this was an age of revival for classical learning, like we've said before, when the deities of Greece and Rome were rediscovered and revered, Freyja, as a Norse goddess, didn't enjoy the same resurgence, and she was largely excluded from this pantheon of interest among Renaissance scholars and artists who favoured the mythologies of antiquity over the barbaric traditions of the North. Norse mythology as a whole was viewed through a very dismissive lens, often treating it as superstition or folklore rather than serious theology and philosophy. So in this sort of environment, Freyja became more of a relic than a subject of admiration. There were some subtle shifts though. As philologists and antiquarians in Northern Europe began to recover and study Old Norse texts, they laid the groundwork for a very slow re-evaluation of figures like Freyja. Still, in the Renaissance, these early scholars were operating within deeply Christian worldviews still, and Freyja was often categorised alongside witches, spirits, and local pagan relics, which were fascinating, but also morally suspect. And any magic or sexual power that she once held was either ignored or interpreted as evidence for her diabolical nature. She was not yet being reclaimed or revered, rather she was being dissected very cautiously by scholars who often saw her as an emblem of pre-Christian error. And because of her association with seiðr, which had by this time become entwined with early modern European conceptions of witchcraft, Freyja was sometimes linked, though indirectly, with witch trials and fears of female sorcery. And though she wasn't directly invoked in sort of demonological, it was demonological, although she was not directly invoked in the demonological tracts of the time, The archetype that she represented, which was this independent, powerful, magically inclined woman, was aligned with what early modern societies feared in so-called witches. Her memory might have contributed to the shaping of witch stereotypes, especially in Scandinavia and Germany, where remnants of Norse belief lingered longest. And the Renaissance was also a time of increasing national identity, particularly in Denmark and Sweden, where the idea of a noble ancient past began to gain cultural currency. But this nationalism leaned heavily on the Bible and Greco-Roman heritage rather than on the Norse gods. Freyja's stories remained sort of tucked away in little sagas and skaldic poetry preserved by Icelandic scholars, but not really fully appreciated by wider European academia. She wasn't resurrected in sculpture or poetry like we would have seen in Venus or Athena or anyone we've spoken about on Ladies of Law so far. Instead, she remained dormant, mentioned occasionally in works, but still pretty largely misunderstood. But despite this general neglect, Freyja's name survived through place names, like we said earlier, calendar references, and little bits and pieces of folklore. In some regions, she might have been remembered in folk traditions under other guises still, like fairy queens, white ladies, and spectral mistresses of nature. And these forms, like we said earlier, they're often stripped of all of the divine origins and were sort of very basic, but maintained a bit of the air of Freyja. And by the time we get to the 17th century, Freyja was very much in the margins of intellectual curiosity. She was acknowledged by scholars, but still interpreted through this rational, often dismissive framework of the age. Because when we get to the Enlightenment period, we've got a period obsessed with reason, with empirical knowledge and classical antiquity again, and the gods of Olympus were seen as elegant personifications of nature or metaphors for human virtues and flaws, and the Norse gods, with Freyja being one of them, were still viewed as this crude invention of a barbaric past, and it was more superstition than true symbolism. But as the Enlightenment period progressed, scholars began to take an interest again. Not for religious reasons, but for linguistic and cultural reasons. And they began to reevaluate and relook at things like the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. And this meant that Freyja, who was preserved within these pages, was reintroduced to the scholarly world as a mythological figure, but not yet as a spiritual or symbolic one. She was not venerated, but she was classified. And where earlier Christians had demonized her, Enlightenment scholars secularized her, and Freyja became an object of analysis, and the sensuality and magical power, once central to her cult, were treated with a mix of curiosity and condescension. Her practice of seiðr, which was once feared, was now seen as a vestige of primitive superstition. To Enlightenment thinkers, Freyja was not dangerous, she was just irrational. She was the embodiment of a worldview that had been rightfully overcome by science and reason. In Germany, where philology was beginning to develop into a rigorous academic discipline, figures like Jacob Grimm would soon begin collecting and analysing folklore and mythology in earnest. Although his major works came quite a bit later, Enlightenment scholars laid the foundation for that movement. And these early thinkers began to draw parallels between Norse and Greco-Roman deities, comparing Freyja with Venus or Aphrodite. But the comparison was a bit uneven. While Venus was idealised in Enlightenment art and literature, Freyja was often seen as her sort of, her like rural, rough around the edges cousin that she hopes doesn't get invited to parties, and who, if anyone asks about her, you just sort of try and move the conversation on. And one really important shift during this time was the growing interest in mythology as a window into the spirit of people. This idea, which would fully bloom in Romantic nationalism, had its roots in Enlightenment historiography. Freyja was not yet a symbol of cultural pride, but scholars began to recognise that myths like hers were valuable records of a society's development. Her attributes began to be catalogued in encyclopedias, discussed in dissertations, and footnoted in translations of the Edda. But she remained a distant curiosity. And she did still persist in folklore, especially in rural communities in Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. She was remembered in songs, local traditions, and place names still, though the mythic grandeur had definitely faded. So I guess the Enlightenment period didn't really rekindle Freyja's fire, so to speak, but it did protect the coals. By cataloguing her and analysing her and preserving the texts that mentioned her, scholars of this era ensured that her myth wouldn't be lost entirely, because in the 19th century, Freyja experienced a profound transformation, emerging from centuries of obscurity into the limelight of romantic imagination. Where the early medieval period had vilified her and the Enlightenment had rationalised her, the 19th century discovered her as a symbol, not just of myth, but of identity. In this age of burgeoning philology, romanticism and cultural revivalism, Freyja was finally reimagined with new depth and passion. The Romantic movement, which swept across Europe in reaction to Enlightenment rationalism, prized emotion, mystery, nature, and the primitive soul of a people. In countries like Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Iceland, artists and intellectuals looked to their own ancestral myths for inspiration. This was the era of people like Wagner, of Norse poetry set to music and ancient gods woven into the fabric of national histories. Freyja, who was once relegated to the footnotes of sagas, was raised once more into poetic grandeur. And Jacob Grimm, who I mentioned earlier, people like him, they played a pivotal role in reviving her image. In his monumental Deutsche Mythology of 1835, Grimm compared Freyja to classical goddesses like Aphrodite, but with an earnestness and seriousness previously denied to Norse figures. He emphasised her maternal and fertility aspects, identifying her as a life-giving force and linking her to older Germanic figures like Frigg and Holder. Freyja, Grimm believed, preserved something essential about the old Germanic soul, and her stories were keys to understanding a pre-Christian moral world. And at the same time, the 19th century was a time of intense national awakening across Scandinavia. As Norway, Denmark, and Sweden asserted cultural independence, they turned to their Norse heritage to construct a heroic past. Freyja, as one of the few prominent goddesses, became an emblem not only of feminine strength, but also of cultural continuity. In literary works, operas, and paintings, she appeared not as a fallen idol, but as a powerful, dignified, and tragic figure, often regal, sometimes sorrowful, and always mysterious. Her tears of gold, once viewed as signs of vanity, became symbols of deep loss and sacred grief. And this period also saw the rise of early feminist scholarship, which began to re-evaluate figures like Freyja through a more sympathetic lens. Scholars and writers were drawn to her independence, her authority over war and death, and her unapologetic sexuality. And there's a really interesting study by Britt Marie Nastrom, and she wrote that perhaps the philologists of the 19th century weren't fully ready to understand the deeper meaning of Freyja, but they did begin to interpret her myth and compare them with different traditions in order to elucidate the image of the goddess. And this effort opened the door for future reinterpretations of Freyja as not only a goddess of love, but a sovereign figure of power, knowledge, and sacred feminine agency. But the 19th century's image of Freyja was not without its own filters and limitations. She was often idealised or romanticised and transformed into a figure of pastoral beauty or noble melancholy, rather than the battle-hardened, magic-wielding deity of earlier myth. Her role in seiðr was often softened or made more abstract, and her sexuality was very much reined in to fit Victorian sensibilities. So in this way, even though she was reclaimed, she was also reshaped a little bit to meet the moral standards of the time. But nevertheless, it was in the 19th century that Freyja finally became more than just a bit of a curiosity and started to transform into a cultural icon. From opera to academic treatise, nationalist history to poetic metaphor, she re-entered Western imagination not as a ghost of the past, but as a vital and evolving symbol. And the seeds planted by Romanticism and philology would fully come to fruit in the 20th and 21st centuries into feminist theology, neo-pagan devotion, and deep scholarly inquiry. And that seems like the perfect time to have a chat about where Freyja can be found in the modern day. In the modern era, Freyja has been reborn, not just remembered, but revitalised, reframed, and reinterpreted across an astonishing array of cultural mediums. She has become a muse, not only for artists and writers, but for feminist theorists, for game designers, for pop musicians, for screenwriters, and for spiritual communities. Her mythological complexity resonates strongly in a 21st century world that seeks multi-dimensional female icons. The figure of Freyja has become a canvas for cultural projection and a mirror reflecting the evolving concerns of modern identity, gender and power. In TV and film, Freyja's direct name might be rare, but her essence permeates female characters shaped by mythic ancestry. The popular series Vikings presented a Norse universe saturated with divine echoes, and while Freyja wasn't a frequent character, her archetype could be seen in Lagertha, who was a warrior shield maiden embodying power, eroticism, grief and independence. And we also see that in the Netflix series The Witcher, which features Yennefer, who we have talked about on the podcast before, but she's a sorceress whose combination of beauty, rage, magical prowess, and personal trauma bears a striking resemblance to Freyja's attributes as recorded in the sagas. And these representations often draw on goddesses not as a literal character, but as an energetic lineage, which has been described as the mythic undercurrent that flows beneath modern heroines. And speaking of The Witcher, in video games, Freyja also emerges in increasingly vivid forms. In God of War Ragnarok, she's not merely a background deity, but she's actually a core character, brought to life through emotional depth and complex motivation. She's a mother racked with loss, a warrior reborn, and a seeress torn between vengeance and forgiveness. Her arc, steeped in Norse cosmology, but also deeply human, is a poignant reimagining of a myth that explores grief, autonomy, and female rage in a manner rarely seen in mainstream media. And this game received critical acclaim for its treatment of mythology with emotional authenticity, underscoring Freyja's enduring appeal in digital storytelling. And it's a game I've not played yet. I've played the first one. Actually, well, I've played it, I've not finished it. I loved it, I just didn't finish it. I have this habit of starting games and then never finishing them. And it's a habit I'm trying to get out of. So I will finish it and then I'll play God of War Ragnarok. I pinky promise. In literature, Freyja has experienced a literary revival, particularly in feminist and mythopoetic works. Authors like Joanne M. Harris, who wrote The Gospel of Loki, and Genevieve Gornichek, who wrote The Witch's Heart, tap into Freyja's mythos to craft heroines who are fierce, flawed, sensual, and spiritually powerful. In academic literature, Britt Marie Nastrom, who I mentioned earlier, she wrote Freyja, the Great Goddess of the North, and this remains one of the most influential reinterpretations, and it frames Freyja as a divine figure of sovereignty and sexual freedom, rather than the morally suspect figure of medieval Christian interpretations. Her eroticism is not a sin, but a sacred power, Nastrom asserts, positioning Freyja as a challenger to patriarchal religious systems. And Freyja's influence in music is equally as rich. She appears in the works of Nordic folk bands like Wardruna, Heilung and Skald, who often chant her name in ritual sounds of music that recreate pre-Christian ceremonial music. The Icelandic band Astadir and Swedish artist Merker invoke her themes in songs of longing, loss and feminine nature. Pop and alternative performance have also drawn from her symbolism. Again, Florence Welch from Florence and the Machine is popping up, because people like her and Björk have crafted these personas rooted in the mystical, the elemental, and the feminine sublime. And there's a really interesting dissertation called Fashioning Pop Personae, and it talks a little bit about gendered performance in music. And Hansen, who wrote it, says that gendered performance in music often revisits mythic roles to signal emotional agency, creative power, and transgression of normativity. And it's really interesting because if you think about it, lots of artists, and we've spoken about them on the podcast, have taken the inspiration from mythological women and sort of blended them together to create their own personas. And Freyja is among these reclaimed roles, and she's an emblem of divine rebellion and vulnerability. In feminist theory, Freyja has become central to neo-pagan and goddess spirituality movements, particularly among heathen and Wiccan traditions. She is invoked not only in rituals, but in feminist theology as a symbol of sacred feminine sovereignty. Her control over seiðr has become a potent metaphor for women's knowledge, intuition, and political agency. In modern feminist reimaginings, Freyja is not only a goddess of love, but she's a force of resistance, resilience, and liberation. Mary Shepard writes that Freyja defies binaries. She's a virgin and whore, warrior and mother, seer and queen. She is all and asks no permission. This multiplicity has made her a favourite figure in gender studies, queer studies, and cultural spirituality alike. And her image is also being used symbolically in activism. In Scandinavian feminist circles, Freyja has appeared on protest banners and digital art, calling for bodily autonomy and gender justice. She's become a spiritual ancestor to those reclaiming the magical woman archetype, not the witch to be burned, but the goddess to be remembered. Her stories are now being included in educational curricula in gender and mythology courses across Europe and North America, which definitely signals her return not only to culture but also to discourse. And she's also there in comics and graphic novels. She appears in comics like The Mighty Thor, where she is reimagined as the All-Mother and counsellor to female Thor. Here she's rendered with political acumen and deep sense of mythic gravity, serving as a narrative fulcrum and a feminist icon. Indie creators have also embraced her, using webcomics and graphic novels to explore her relationships and her rage and her refusal to be forgotten. Freyja in the modern day is a woman of many masks. She is a digital avatar, a scholar's subject, a spiritual guide, and a pop star's silent muse. She walks through music videos and game screens, appearing in the notes of ritual chants and synth-pop lyrics, smiles from between the lines of poetry and the beats of bass-heavy electronica. Her golden tears still fall, but now they're crystallised in digital form, refractions of memory, myth, and the modern mind. Freyja is not merely a myth, she's a presence, in poetry and politics and personal power. She embodies the unresolved tensions that we still live with between desire and duty, between softness and strength, between magic and meaning. She defies singularity just as we do, and perhaps that's why we return to her, if not for answers, but to witness a goddess who holds contradictions without shame. Thank you so much for joining me today on Ladies of Lore. I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode. I've really loved having a little break from Greece, if I'm honest. I love Greek mythology, but it's been nice to dive into something completely different. And it's really interesting to talk about how Norse mythology was viewed so differently by scholars in the Renaissance period and in the Enlightenment period. It's so interesting to think how sort of Greco-Roman myths were put on a pedestal and Norse mythology was seen as barbaric and not worth studying. And I hope that you've enjoyed that exploration too. And if you have liked the episode today, please feel free to follow on your favourite podcast platform. If you're on Spotify or YouTube, you can always leave me a comment. You can always leave me a review. That always makes my day. And if you want to talk to me, you can over on TikTok and Blue Sky. All of the links to everything you need will be in the show notes. Thank you again so much for joining me on today's episode of Ladies of Lore. I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.